Mass familial suicide, where all participants are on board with proceedings, is an extremely rare event, more so in 1927, New Zealand, where the population was barely 1.5 million. Back then, gun crime was also rare, even given access to firearms was actually easy, a factor in this case. On the other hand, ever since records have been kept, New Zealand has always had a suicide rate double that, say, of compatible countries like Canada. But these weren't exactly Kiwis, naturalised New Zealanders. 3 of the 4 had only got off the boat from England just 12 days prior. You could hardly call them locals. The Kiddells were Welsh. The coroner painted the family's suicide as a death pact. Mum, dad, brother and sister were all down on the deal. The question still remains if this was actually the case. Could the husband and father, Ernest, have executed his entire family and then shot himself? The way the body of Lorna, the daughter, was found seemed to indicate she didn't see it coming. Colin was engaged at the time. It was true, Louisa, the mother, went to the trouble of signing her husband's detailed suicide note, stating in black and white, "With my consent." That could of course have been done as a result of coercion, a gun pointed at her head by her husband, for example. In old man Kiddell's suicide note, he was adamant he was the full quid, and probably not the opinion of much of the public. Undoubtedly, he was the ringleader, the villain of the piece. The police's theory was all four suffered from a broad-based medical term employed at the time, neurasthenia. For any layman, that's a hard one to nail down and also pronounce. A condition that encompasses mental breakdowns through to what we would now call chronic fatigue syndrome. The very adaptable neurasthenia also included those who were overly anxious of what lay ahead. A lot of what made Ernest's concerns revolved around the family's financial position, when for the time Ernest was probably what we would term middle class. His lifetime job as a customs officer in the UK meant he could retire on a steady pension. By my calculations, a guaranteed income of about 25% more than the one received by Kiwi retirees at the time. Then there was also the nest egg from selling the family house and other savings. His son had just purchased a farm equating to a small business. His wife was a teacher who specialised in languages, and he had a daughter well capable of going out and getting a similar job in education. To look at what started this fearful tragedy, the events of June 1927, we need to go back 3 years. When Colin left the UK and settled into farming life in the central North Island, Mangaweka. Apart from being considered nervous, nothing about his personality seemed to lend itself towards taking his life. He played cricket and football in the local team, went to the pub, was engaged to a local lass. Things were tough for him on the farm he'd just purchased, making a crust. Could be considered the ebb and flow of running a small farm. When he got wind of his father retiring, he offered them a new life, join him in New Zealand and pool their resources. That was an offer Ernest embraced, and they would up sticks from Wales and start a new life down under. This decision wasn't greeted with much enthusiasm by either wife or daughter. It must have been somewhat of a surprise, come out of left field. He was the homeboy, the other two were the ones who went on trips to the continent. Mrs. Louisa Kiddell was a French teacher, city girl, wasn't keen to be moving to rural life anywhere on the map. If they had to go to New Zealand, she wanted to be in the relative big lights of Auckland. She was, and always had been, a bit of a worrywart, prone to over-ruminating, some of which had been passed down to her daughter. At 23, Lorna had a very serious boyfriend on the go, a job she liked. That was at the local Cardiff College, involving languages once again. She highly resented her brother uprooting the family. Lorna, though, had mental demons she would fight now and again, suffering serious bouts of depression. She wasn't really in a position to say no. To add to the overall health issues, Ernest was recovering from having a kidney removed and got fatigued easily. None of them were exactly what you would call a health specimen. Their descent began to manifest on board the SS Remuera. Obvious to casual observers on the vessel. One moment Ernest would be a chirper, next breath he would be telling fellow passengers he was worried about money. Neurotic Louisa fed into all of this. Lorna spent much of the journey locked in her cabin with the curtains drawn. When she did venture out, she would only communicate with her parents. The morose situation, culminating in Ernest telling one of his fellow passengers, in a chilling portent, provided that everyone else was saved, I wish the boat would go down with the three of us and thus end all our troubles. Fellow passengers were concerned enough for one to make an offer of a house in Hamilton. Things were therefore unwinding even before the threesome had placed a foot on New Zealand soil. There would be worse news to come when they reached New Zealand. Colin had had a breakdown of some kind, wouldn't be there to meet them. The downward spiral accelerated, with nowhere to sleep and no friends. Ernest's obsessive stinginess, and they spent 6 nights at the Salvation Army People's Palace before securing a rental. A bungalow house in West Street, Mount Albert, where they were joined by Colin. Not happy campers. When Colin broke the news about his financial woes, the die was cast. Kiddell Sr.'s thought processes were meticulously outlined in his suicide note. So far, the reclusive family had spent virtually their entire time inside the house, alone, aside a trip to the shops. That changed on day 5 at West Street. Ernest Kiddell ordered a taxi and drove first to the police station and secured a gun permit on the premise it was for pest control on his son's farm, then to a gun shop where he purchased a .32 rifle and 100 rounds. The most likely sequence that day was Lorna was shot through the back of the head as she sat on the sofa in the lounge. The good money says she never saw it coming. Louisa and her son Colin were on the bed in the parents' bedroom. Louisa had her arm around Colin. Who was to die first of the pair is unknown. Ernest now took the gun and literally blew his brains out, the bullet going through the ceiling of the bedroom. In 90 seconds, all 4 were dead. It would be a week and a half till anyone thought they hadn't seen anything of their new neighbours and called the police, alerted by the lights being on 24/7. Gunshots had been heard on the 23rd, just Auckland wasn't entirely a built-up area like it is today. There were tracts of land where you could illegally pot shop rabbits. Hearing a gun go off wasn't a thing to call the police about. The suicide note and letters to his friends back in the UK meant it was a close and shut case from a whodunit perspective. The speculation back then that persists to today, and now psychology and mental health are way more advanced, revolves around the state of mind of the family. Schizophrenia was one possibility given its inheritable nature. Mass delusion and paranoia, as we saw in the isolated community in, say, Jonestown. Questions still remain. Who exactly were the ones suffering psychotic episodes? Who were the willing or unwilling participants outside Ernest? And that's a mystery which will never be solved. The 2 parents would be buried in one grave, and the son and daughter in another. The Anglican minister who oversaw the funeral, the one on your screen, was one of the very few people to know the family before the tragedy. He was on the SS Remuera. It was him the family had confided they wished the boat would sink, with just them in it. This channel would be dead without subscribers. Subscribers are the metric that drive all channels. Your subscription would be greatly appreciated. Means a lot to me as an amateur researcher and creator. I'll spot you next time. Bye for now.